Christmas Eve in Nebraska, and while folks were getting ready to celebrate, a 9-year-old boy lay frozen to death in a ditch outside the small town of Chester. He was clad only in a little blue sleeper.
It would then be 2 long years before this child would even be identified. Until that time, he was known only as Little Boy Blue. And the story that would unfold about the way he had died and the way he had lived would horrify, and is still horrifying, many, many people. How could a parent have left his own flesh and blood in a ditch in the middle of winter in Nebraska to die? And here to help us understand the answers to some of these very unsettling questions is an author of a book called Abandoned Prayers. Please welcome Gregg Olsen.
Nice to have you here.
And we should say Gregg Olsen from Bellevue, too.
Yes.
Right, local
Nice,
guy.
nice to have a local author with us. Why don't we begin with what attracted you, Gregg, to the story? Why this story?
You know, everybody asks me that, and that's a tough one to really know the answer to. I was a father in 1985. I had twin girls, and the idea of a child being left, you know, in a little sleeper in the middle of nowhere, you know, tugged at me, and as I think it does a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And that's it.
Tell me about the discovery. Who made the discovery of the body and when?
Okay, a truck driver, Chuck Cleveland, was out on his way to get his haircut, and he was driving to Hebron, which is the county seat in that little area. He saw a little bit of blue fabric or something out there in the field, and he got out of his truck and found the body.
This is on a very quiet, rural road.
It's on
Outside.
a quiet rural road on Christmas Eve at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. What did he do?
Okay, he called the sheriff. The sheriff came down, and you know, first they thought it was a little girl's body because of the way the body was laying in the ditch out there. The sheriff came, and they had the state police come down, and there was all sorts of activity. It was not exactly the typical Christmas Eve or that little town anyway.
Any obvious cause of death?
Well, at first they saw a sort of a purple mark around the child's neck that they believed indicated ligature or some sort of strangulation. There were also purplish and reddish marks on the child's forehead that they believed, you know, could have been like the result of a beating of some kind. And then the other thing that was a hindrance to their investigation at that time was part of the child's face had been chewed by small rodents. So there was some evidence that probably had, I don't know, gone away.
Right.
Tell us where the nickname Little Boy Blue is taken from.
It was, you know, the media really named him Little Boy Blue. A lot of people say the town did, but the town, they called him Matthew, which meant gift of God.
Yes.
They had given him a name because he was an unknown child. But it was the blue sleeper, you know, and that's blue sleeper. I keep telling people that's what really got me, you know, that little soft blue sleeper and a little child out in the middle of nowhere.
A sleeper with feet in it, and somewhat inappropriate as dress for a child of his age.
You're right, and he was a 9-year-old boy, and I don't know any 9-year-old kids that would wear a sleeper.
Yeah. For a long time, there was simply no evidence to identify this child. The law enforcement officials were just totally baffled.
Right. They got leads from, you know, hundreds of people across the country, you know, inundated this little town. The National Center for Missing Children, you know, cooperated with them. And that was one thing that really, you know, struck these investigators, was how many children were missing and how many people were desperate to find out where their kids were. And a lot of them were children that had been taken away by the custodial parent.
Sure.
The town decided to give this child a funeral.
Right. They all worked together, a little town of 300 people. They donated a coffin. They donated a plot.
They gave him a name.
They gave him a name. They did everything they could for that child. And when you find out the rest of the story, that makes it even sadder.
Yes.
Yes, it truly does.
How long after the body was found did Reader's Digest publish its article?
And theirs came out in November of '87, so it was almost 2 years.
2 years later. And then activity
Fast.
in the investigation really picked up.
Right, right. They got some leads. Some people said, well, that sounds like Danny Stutzman. And a family in Wyoming sent a picture in, and that led to the identification of the child. But it was 2 years later.
What was the connection to the family in Wyoming, the Barlows?
Okay, the Barlows were a couple that Eli Stutzman, the father of this child, had left his son with in July of 1985, and they took care of him as foster parents.
Kind of left him in their care.
Kind of.
While he went to,
He had other things to do.
He had other things, that's the way of putting it, the other things to do. The Barlows also took what would turn out to be the last picture of Danny
Right.
Stutzman,
Right.
of this child. And I think we have that photograph there. Now, so
Right.
this was at Christmas time.
Right, this was taken on December 14th in the morning, and
It's Danny with his father.
right, Danny and Eli getting ready to leave. And
He'd been with the Barlows for some time now, and
Since
Eli
July.
was coming back to pick him up.
Right, Eli came to pick him up, and later we learned that that was the day that Danny died. So this picture was taken the morning that he did die that evening.
Just hours before.
12 hours later,
Yeah,
he was dead in that ditch.
So his father picked him up. He left with his father, and he died that day.
Right.
Is it, in a word, can anyone say who left him in the ditch?
Well, Eli says he did, you know, and if we're going to believe Eli after reading this book or learning his story, you know, that's one matter. But Eli says that, you know, he... Do you want to hear how he...
Well, in just a minute, so hold that
Eli
thought
also
because
claims, however, that Danny died of natural causes.
Right. Danny
And-
did have a virus
Yeah.
that he was taking medication for, Haemophilus, with strep-like condition, and he did, you know, have something wrong with him, but it was not life-threatening or anything like that. And if you look at that picture, that's not a sick kid.
Right, right. We'll take a short pause here. If Danny had left Wyoming in the custody of his father, why? Why would he be left in that ditch? And how could his father have possibly done such a thing? We'll shed some light on all this and some other crimes in just a minute.
Does your nonprofit club or organization have a message that you would like to have to reach thousands of Northwest viewers? If so, Northwest Afternoon may be able to help. Just call 443-8333 for more information.
Author Gregg Olsen is with us, and to really understand this character named Eli Stutzman, or to really understand why he could have done what he did, we have to understand him as a person a little bit. Take us back to his childhood. He was raised in the Amish country, in the Amish faith, and yet even from childhood, he rebelled.
Absolutely. It got worse as he got older, but he was a kid that did not fit in, and his own parents admitted that to me, that he was not truthful, that he you know, fabricated stories, tried to cover up his tracks when he was 8 years old, you know, playing with a gasoline-powered cart that he shouldn't have been playing with. Small things like that, but they grew larger as he got older.
And a consistent pattern of things.
Absolutely.
His relationship with his father was terrible.
Right.
They ended up not speaking.
Right. Well, he was put under the ban. You know, the Amish have the ban.
Right.
And Eli had been put under the ban twice.
Where you're shunned, people
Right,
will
we're
not
shunned.
speak with you? Or?
Well, they'll speak with you, but they won't really, you're not really a part of them anymore. They won't take things from your hand, but you could put something down on the table and they could pick that up. You know, they have ways of getting around it, but
Yeah.
it's interesting.
We have a viewer with a phone call, too. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, where was the boy's mother when all this happened?
Danny's mother.
Where was the mother, Danny's mother?
When Danny died,
Through all
Throughout.
of this.
well, she died in 1977 when Danny was 10 months old.
How did she die?
She died in a barn fire that was very suspicious.
How so?
Eli Stutzman had told people that Ida had a heart condition, and there was no evidence to ever support that.
Even her doctor said she
Even
didn't
her
have a
doctor
heart
said,
condition.
hey, no way, this guy is not telling the truth. But she was an Amish woman, and there was no investigation done because they felt that the Amish wouldn't lie.
Were there suspicions among the Amish, however, that Eli was not being truthful about this the barn fire?
Oh, absolutely.
And Ida's death?
Right. The Amish knew about it from the minute the smoke was clearing. They had the idea, but they are, you know, they're not allowed to be a part of our world and to get involved with our criminal investigations. They prefer to handle things on their own.
Did they also suspect, however, that Eli began to abuse Danny when he was raising him on his own?
The Amish, well, yeah, the Amish knew, you know, Ida's brothers, you know, had an encounter with Eli. They were 16-year-old boys, you know, twins, and Eli tried to have a sexual relationship with these two boys, and there were other signs that some unusual sexual things were going on with this Amish man that they saw, and they worried about the little boy and how that might affect him.
We have a gentleman on the phone with us today who actually lived with Danny and Eli for a time after the mother died in the barn fire, and he is with the same old order Amish group. Levi Swartzentruber is with us. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it, and perhaps you can help shed some light for us on this man. How did his personality strike you when you spent time with him?
He came across like a very nice gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
But there always was something underneath that I knew that wasn't right.
Can you describe what made you feel it wasn't right? Any example or anything in particular?
There was times that he just wanted to isolate himself. Times where he just stayed in his bedroom, and I didn't quite understand that. That was when I first left the Amish, and everything was foreign to me out here, because they do keep you away from the outside world as much as possible.
Yeah.
You know, it's looks like a beautiful life to look at, but if you live in that lifestyle, I don't know, it's a lot of dictatorship, and I don't know, it sounds pretty cool, but it seems a lot like a cult.
Comment, if you will, because it has bearing on the story, Levi, about Eli's sexual preference for men, and did he begin to exhibit that at all openly in your presence?
No, not in my presence, no.
Were you suspicious of it?
After a couple months, I became suspicious of it for the simple fact that one night he talked me into getting dressed up in my Amish clothes and go with him and some other guys to a bar.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of questioned him about what kind of bar, why would we want to do this? And he said, oh, it's just for fun. And I said, well, okay, I'm game for it, and I went for it, and he took me to a gay bar. And that's when I thought, now, wait a minute, I don't want any part of this life, and I started talking to friends of mine about it, and they said, well, I think you better get out.
Mm-hmm.
Did Eli seem quite comfortable in that setting?
Yeah, he did. He was up dancing with different males, and, he was enjoying himself. And I did not enjoy myself.
Levi, we also in the book, it addresses incidents where, an incident in particular, where at home you remember hearing Danny say to his father, "Stop it, don't do that."
Yeah, that's correct. I came down from upstairs one time, it was like in the late afternoon, early evening, and Danny and Eli were in Eli's bedroom, and as I reached the bottom of the steps, I heard Danny say, "Don't do that to me," and that's all I heard.
Were you concerned about Danny's welfare, especially as a result of that?
After I found out and realized that Eli is gay or bisexual, whatever, I became concerned about Danny. How can I get Danny out of this? But being born and raised Amish and just, coming out of it, everything out here was foreign to me. Now, today I realize you got children's services for, be a good start for something like that.
We are grateful, Levi, for your comments today. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk with us.
Okay.
Greg, what was the attitude of Ida's parents, Danny's grandparents, toward Eli?
Oh, I don't think they wanted Ida to marry Eli, but they felt it was her decision. She was of age, which is 21 in their community. They can pretty much do as they want, but they weren't comfortable with Eli. They felt that he had been dishonest to them, and he had fabricated a situation where he had stabbed himself and left threatening notes. I don't know.
He staged some pretty bizarre incidents.
Very bizarre,
Yeah. Something else that I want to mention, because we do have to go to break in a moment, is that I want us to be careful not to make a blanket indictment of homosexuals or to imply that homosexuality therefore leads to child abuse.
Right.
In no way is that the case, and I think it's important because in a minute we'll also talk about the fact that his homosexuality went to extremes
Absolutely.
of behavior, and that's really what we're talking about here, not an issue of homosexuality connected with abuse. I wanted to make that point.
And some of the lifestyle to which this young child would soon be exposed became even more grotesque and sinister because it even included murder, to which this youngster was probably a witness. We'll talk about that right after this. This coming Wednesday at Northwest Afternoon, we'll hear from local people with compelling evidence that the Northwest is being visited by UFOs and even the notorious Bigfoot. Be a part of our studio audience. Call 443-8333 to reserve your free audience tickets.
We're talking about a really bizarre individual, frankly, who ends up on quite a crime spree. Eli Stutzman took his son Danny to the Four Corners area of the U.S., which is, catch me if I'm wrong, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico.
You're wrong.
No, I am wrong. Four Corners. Give me those four corners.
Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona.
That's it.
And Utah.
And one more. Mm-hmm. Okay. And describe for me in reasonable detail Eli's lifestyle.
Okay. Eli took Danny. They lived on a really beautiful ranch in the Durango area. And Eli had a sense of freedom that he had never had in the Amish country, and he really cut loose. He took Danny to these parties. Do you want to hear that?
Again, within reason? Yeah.
He took Danny to parties and told Danny to do things with men that were in the parties, to touch them in a certain way, which Danny did do. Danny, at that time, began to exhibit behavior that indicated that he was following his father's lifestyle, even though he was only 6 years old.
So Danny was being used, you would say, as a pawn with older men.
As a sexual party favor with older men.
Okay. Was there sex at the parties?
Yes, there was.
So Danny would have been witness to that also?
Absolutely.
Drug use at the parties?
Absolutely. Rampant.
How did Danny's developmental difficulties exhibit themselves most clearly?
He was disfluent. He had a stuttering problem that, when the life was better, his problem improved, and when it got worse, when trauma happened, he could barely speak.
We have a phone call. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Hi. I just finished reading Abandoned Prayers. And what I would really like to be able to comprehend and try to get an understanding of is these people that were at these parties knew what was going on. None of them came forward and said anything. How do they feel today knowing that little boy's dead?
People did even see bruises, let alone all of this behavior at these parties, and nobody came forward.
And I think a lot of them are very regretful of that right now, but they felt that their privacy, which was their sexual preference, they did not want that exposed, and they traded on that boy's life.
Also, many individuals in the book, Greg, you portray as seeing Stutzman, Eli Stutzman, as a very good father, a caring, loving father. Was he just an incredible con man?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he would be, if you would go to meet him, and you were not in his lifestyle, you would think he was a wonderful dad, and he would show you, the things that he did for his son. He made his son's clothes. He cooked and he canned the food that they ate. I mean, he was a single dad, and he was a jewel. But if you were in his other world, you might see a different man.
Why do you think the Barlows never came forward and with their contention that perhaps Danny was not being treated properly by his father?
Okay, the Barlows, Dean Barlow had been a lover of Eli's, and he lived in a very small town in Wyoming, and they didn't want that out.
Or probably wanted his wife to know.
I don't know if she knew. I never talked to the Barlows. I talked to the investigators who worked that case, and I don't know if she knew. She might not have.
But he certainly didn't want that exposure of himself.
Right.
Okay. Eventually, Glenn Pritchett, one of Eli's, well, my word.
We're sitting here
Moving
doing a
right
show
along.
and the studio's falling apart.
one of Eli's roommates would turn up dead.
Right.
Tell me how any connection was made between that roommate and Eli in terms of his death.
Okay, Eli and Glenn Pritchett, a nice guy from Montana, they were living down there in Austin, and the body was found in the middle of nowhere in a ditch, not unlike where Danny's body would later turn up 6 months later. Out in a ditch, the police finally figured out who this guy was. They knocked on the door.
And shot through the head?
Shot through the head, badly decomposed. They knocked on Stutzman's door and said, you know, where's Glenn Pritchett? Do you know anything about him? And Eli said, well, I put him on a bus in early May. And the medical examiners determined that Glenn Pritchett would have been dead at that point. You know,
long since.
Long since.
Mm-hmm. So that was the first lie.
That was the first lie.
That began to lead.
And then Eli left town that night.
Judy in the audience has a question.
Do you think that Danny knew about that murder? That maybe he witnessed it or something?
Yeah, I believe that. In one interview that Stutzman gave to the investigators that caught him down in Texas, he did say that Danny and I were in bed. We heard a gunshot. We were really afraid, and then we went out in the living room, and there was some blood or something, and that put him there. And then another statement that another man that lived with Eli down there in Austin, he said that Danny and I and Eli were in the car coming home from being questioned by the sheriff's department.
Is this the Miller, the young Miller?
Yes, Sam Miller, another Amish kid. Mm-hmm. He said that, Eli told me, keep your mouth shut. I had to do it. Glenn was getting in the way, and I had to move the body. Well, little Danny was sitting there next to them, and Danny did not act like this was news to him. He knew the whole thing.
Mm. So Miller virtually says that Stutzman acknowledged having committed the murder.
Right.
You think there's any chance he might have killed Danny because Danny knew?
That's what the police believe. I don't know if that much, I don't put much credence in that. I mean, I think he did kill Danny, not so much for the murder, but that Danny was no longer of use to him, nothing that he wanted in his life anymore.
We'll take a break. Next, the story Eli Stutzman had to tell about how his young son ended up freezing to death in that ditch. You'll hear what he said about it in a minute.
We have a phone call on the line for our guest, Gregg Olsen. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, I was just wondering, has Eli been put behind bars yet?
Where is Eli today?
He's in prison in Texas right now, serving a 40-year sentence.
For
the murder of Glenn Pritchett.
The murder of Glenn Pritchett.
Right.
However, when he was first taken into custody, that connection had not yet been made.
Right.
And he was brought into custody because of the fact that his son had been found dead. When he was asked to explain that, Greg, what story did he offer?
Oh, it was a great story. He said around midnight they were driving across country to get to Ohio for Christmas, and he said that he reached back and he felt, Danny wasn't alive. And he pulled over and, freaked out, he said in the transcript. He said, I freaked out, I didn't know what to do, I think he was afraid because he knew the police were after him for this Pritchett murder, and he left the body out there in the ditch.
Did he say why he left it out?
He said he left it where God could find it.
He had bought the blue sleeper.
Right, as a Christmas present.
In which Danny was found.
Where God could find it.
Mm-hmm.
Was he ever tried for the murder of his son?
No, because one thing we haven't hit on was that he was, the cause of death has never been determined for Danny Stutzman. They, all the evidence, the circumstantial evidence points to murder, but the pathologists, and there were 3 of them that looked at the case, they can't say whether he was smothered or what. But
or froze to death?
They believe that's a possibility. Eli even admitted at one point that Danny could have been alive when he laid him out there in that ditch.
He said that?
Right.
What do you believe with respect to that question?
Was he alive when he laid out there? I think he was already dead. I think he was smothered and left out there, discarded out there. I don't think, that Eli, could have, be so cold as to leave a living child out there to freeze to death in the middle of the night.
It's beyond anybody's comprehension, isn't it? We'll take a phone call. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes. Is it true that Eli Stutzman has AIDS? And if so, is he still alive?
He carries the virus. He's not manifested the disease, that we know of right now, but he was tested, and he has been tested positive on 2 occasions.
So he is alive, and he is serving his sentence in Huntsville, Texas,
Right.
which is the state penitentiary. There are, very quickly, there are 2 other murders. Is he being investigated for those murders?
Right. There are 2 killings in Colorado. A friend of Eli's, a business associate, and then another young man who were both killed within 3 weeks of each other at the same time that Danny died, when Eli was in town. And investigators right now are trying to get an interview with Eli to pursue him on those cases, and they feel like they've got enough to at least talk to him about him.
Do they feel they have enough evidence to make a good case against him?
No, they need more evidence, and that's part of the problem. There are people out there that know things that don't want to say anything that happened to Danny, and it's happening to other kids. But it's also in this case, these people have got to come forward and say what they know.
Do you think, aside from his wife and his son and his roommate and these 2 other men, which is 5, you think there are any other crimes he's connected with?
The rumor, I heard this week, the rumor in the Amish country is that Eli has killed 16 people. But, the Amish are a good one for rumors, and I don't know if any of that's true. But he has been, one investigator said, hey, this guy could be a Ted Bundy. There could be other bodies out in the middle of nowhere that we don't know about yet.
It's a fascinating book. Thanks for telling the story today. Nice to have had you here and to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And we'll come back and tell you about Monday's Northwest Afternoon in just a moment.
Gregg Olsen's book, Abandoned Prayers, is now available at most local bookstores.